Mondays with Mike.
It's going to be a bumpy ride for 2025.
To our viewers, Senator Bernie Sanders gave a reply to Trump's pseudo State of the Union. Apparently, presidents don't give States of the Union on their first coming to office. But he gave a speech. It was a very long speech, about 90 minutes long, and Bernie made a reply. I thought that Mike and I would take this week and consider Senator Bernie Sanders' reply. Any comments on that before we do, Mike?
Honestly, I wish the reply had been longer, if anything. I do think it's a good idea to respond to Bernie's reply just because he right now seems to be the loudest voice of what might be called the opposition to Trump since Bernie's doing his anti-oligarchy tour around the states right now. He's making a lot of noise and being heard, which I think at least advances a message. It's just not clear if that's the message that the Democratic Party is going to rally behind right now. But he's one of the loudest in the arena, in the marketplace of ideas, and so it's worth talking about what he's saying.
Yeah, and I think what made an impression on me in terms of Bernie is that his position has been remarkably consistent throughout the years, even so far back as the first Gulf War. I'll even say, I think the first Gulf War was a good thing for the U.S. to do, but Bernie gave a speech advising against it. And just that kind of consistency throughout the years has been extremely noteworthy to me. And I think is a mark of intellectual integrity, I would call it. Agree or disagree with him, I think he's got intellectual integrity. So the first thing I wrote that we should take note of in his message is that he said, we're no longer moving toward an oligarchy, we are living in an oligarchic state. I don't know what I think about that. What do you think about it, Mike?
I think we've been closer to oligarchy than not since the Citizens United decision that sort of opened the spigot on political contributions, that there's no cap on the amount of money corporations or people can contribute to politics in some senses, that the definition of an oligarchy is ruled by the few at its most basic definition. And right now, it's very apparent that there's an unelected billionaire who's making very significant, very dramatic cuts to the United States government in return, as far as I can tell, for contributing the most money for any individual to Trump's campaign. He contributed significant amounts of his own wealth, and he used the companies that he owns to provide Trump with an equivalent amount of contributions. I'm thinking in particular of the X interview that happened with Trump during the election where they talked for hours. There was no similar amount of time given to Kamala Harris where she sat and had a conversation that could amplify her message to that degree. I was looking at Open Secrets at the top contributors to Trump's campaign, and there were three individuals in particular that contributed over 100 million, which means, as far as I can tell, that they have outsized influence on everything that's happening in the country right now in terms of the policy priorities, the direction that we're going for foreign policy. I think Bernie is more right than he's not, that we are in what looks like an oligarchy because those with significant amounts of money have much more sway than they used to over the political fortunes of candidates. Right now, it's sad or depressing about the state of the political climate is that Musk apparently is able to utilize the threat of his vast wealth to primary members of the House of Representatives for Republican that if they don't get in line, right, if they don't follow the diktats, as it were, the commands from on high of all the cuts, all the firings, all the funding priorities, et cetera, if they demonstrate something resembling a spine and actually try to stand up for their constituents, that they'll be primaried and not in a good way. There will be significant amounts of money poured across the board against any Republican who steps out of line. That is new. That one person so blatantly has so much power, not just monetary power, but they have access to a platform that can either amplify a candidate or stifle a candidate. That stifling is a big deal in our huge interconnected digital age, because if you're not heard, people won't vote for you as much as they'll vote for whoever is the loudest in the room. We know this from Trump deciding to buy his own social media platform or create one so that he could publish his truths, right? Immune from the banning and all the censoring from Facebook and Twitter after January 6th. That made a difference, right? It's very clear that those with significant amounts of money are able to control the government in a way that people who don't have any kind of access to that kind of wealth just don't. They're not heard. They're not followed. It matters for some of these other topics we're going to talk about. Yes, we're closer to an oligarchy now. And Joe Biden said this on his way out the door in his last address. He said, we're headed towards an oligarchy and a technological ring of people, of the tech companies that are wielding outsized power, not just with money, but also with the platforms that they have.
We can say, in terms of a noun for our government type, was a federal republic, and it can be said to remain such. But I think that of similar importance are adjectives that can be used to describe our government, like democratic has a meaning, rule by the masses of the people, where a place where the masses of the people, their voice carries weight and they wield power. Oligarchic, on the other hand, would be a place where the few wield power. And I would say plutocratic, because it used to be, prior to the Citizens United decision, that when individuals gave money to campaigns, they were quite limited in what they could give. And it was all. Was it noted in like a public record if they gave more than a certain amount of money? I think it was, right?
Yeah, there was a cap on contributions. You could only
Right.
contribute a certain amount of money, and it was all publicly. It all had to
Yeah.
be stated in the public record, as it were. One of the other
Yeah.
issues right now with these political contributions is actually what's called dark money. It's where people
Mhm.
contribute anonymously to these political action committees and various groups. You don't really know who's contributing unless they're willing to publicly state that they're contributing. So the only reason
Mhm.
that, for instance, I know that Mellon was one of the largest contributors to Trump's campaign is because he publicly stated it. He said, I'm doing it. The reason that we know that Musk was one of the largest contributors to Trump's election campaign was because he had such a visible role. He said he was doing it, and then he did it. That we know that those people, those individuals, are contributing so much because they publicly announce it. Because that's one of the facets of them wielding their power is they're trying to not only contribute money, but also to contribute their stature, their reputation, their platform, and that's a
Mhm.
little different. But yes, you're right that it is the rule more of the plutocrats and of those who are heavily invested in increasing their own money in various forms in
Yeah.
various ways. What's pretty clear right now is that Musk is using his power to direct contracts towards his companies. The big fight that seems to be going on right now is with the FAA and Starlink. That's the most public one I've seen. But we also saw that strange saga that happened with the $400 million armored Teslas that the State Department was saying that they might buy, and I guess that was pulled back or something. But the Democrats are looking; they're saying, "What's going on? Can you explain how this even came to be?"
Yeah. Those Cybertrucks, they do look like they're from Back to the Future Part 2. So if we're in Back to the Future Part 2, is it the one where Biff still has the almanac, or is it the one where he's doing the auto detailing?
Time will tell. Right? We will see. Stay
Uh-huh.
tuned on that one. But yeah,
Right.
in terms of what you're talking about of plutocrats, absolutely. That the move has been away from these groups or group focused politics, which certainly still exists, right? The NRA still wields a lot of power, but it wielded more power when there were caps on individual contributions, because then it was those groups that had many members who could say, look, if you don't support gun rights in a certain way, in the way we argue and articulate, we're going to have our members show up and protest at your primaries, or we're going to have, people power. There's going to be protests and letter writing campaigns and boycotts, etc. But now,
Mhm.
because power and wealth is so concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people, in the country, those individuals are able to wield way more power than those organizations even can, because money
Hmm.
at the end of the day is what fuels campaigns.
I would say that the question whether money is speech. I'm not going to take a stance on whether money is speech, but I will say money buys megaphones. I would agree that the rich, they've got a lot of power in this country compared to how they used to. Would I'm just a stickler for semantic meanings. It's probably one of my flaws, maybe, but I would call it a kind of soft power because all that would need to happen would be people stop trusting the internet or get off social media or something like that. Now, is that going to happen? Fat chance. Not right now, anyway. But money and speech influence votes, but I think votes remain the power. But it all might be semantic. I say these things to make people hopeful, and maybe in vain. But anything further to say about that?
So I will disagree on one aspect of what you said, that the rich have more power now than they've had in the past. Arguably, the wealthy have had the most power in the country during the Civil War when they managed to split the country in half.
I meant the recent past, but
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
the recent
Yeah.
past, absolutely. Wealth has and power have become more synonymous for political power, in that those who have the wealth to contribute significantly to campaigns have much more say in what happens for policy priorities, and also have much more influence, unfortunately, in what isn't a policy priority. So in this case right now, it sure looks like people gainfully employed in the federal government making decent amounts of money just isn't as much of a priority as firing huge numbers of people. That there's a clear difference of opinion as to what's valuable for the federal government to do, and we're seeing it play out in real time. But yeah,
Mm.
no, I'll agree with you that the rich definitely wield huge amounts of political power right now.
Okay. Bernie says, let's take a hard look at the problems that America is facing. I'll state all these out front, and then we can see where we want to go. He says 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. He says today in America, our healthcare system is broken, it is dysfunctional, and is outrageously expensive. We remain the only wealthy nation on earth not to guarantee health care for all. We have 800,000 Americans who are homeless. 20 million of our people spend more than half of their limited income on housing, and we have a major housing crisis in America. What do you think has conspired to lead to 60% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, if we can believe Bernie's facts on this?
Sure, let's start there. Part of it's inflation, part of it's greed. The big one would be the collapse of unions. Union membership is in decline compared to the height of the labor movement. And so labor is one of the best vehicles for, especially organized labor, is one of the best. I don't, when I say labor, unions is one of the best
Hmm.
vehicles for getting things like increased wages, increased benefits, more job security, and pensions. And the absence of unions has led to all sorts of problems that other countries with much more robust union presence don't face. Uh, Probably the best example I can think of in terms of comparison would be if you look at the average income for McDonald's workers in the United States compared to McDonald's workers in European countries that have unionized laborers. It's not even close. In some of the cases, they're making 3 times more than workers in McDonald's in the United States. There is a clear movement in the United States to move away from increasing incomes for workers and figuring out ways to stifle worker advancement. So, what do I mean by that? That if benefits accrue at full time work, that companies make a very serious effort to do work up to 39 hours or 30, whatever qualifies as not full time, so workers don't access benefits, which means that you have increased scheduling issues of last minute scheduling and all this other stuff. But there's also been a movement away from pensions to of a guaranteed pension to a 401k, which is subject to market conditions more. The list goes on as to why they're living paycheck to paycheck. But what is very clear is that the incentives in the system benefit those at the very top to reduce workforce instead of to retain workforce. So if you want to make money as a CEO in the United States and your compensation is tied to stock value, stocks all too often go up when there's that huge reduction in force at companies that happen. They go, oh, we fired 10% or 15% of our workers, so we've got less money in the red for paying for workers, so that gives us a stock bump. And then the CEO who they get a bonus based off, quite often they get a bonus based off of if they can increase the stock value a certain amount, they get that bonus. But that bonus is at the cost of the workers. And so the whole issue that's been going on, and Hillary Clinton actually mentioned this in her campaign much more than Trump ever mentioned it, was that we moved away from a stakeholder system for corporations, that corporations were viewed as sort of part of the community and that all the stakeholders would work together to figure out how to make life better for everyone because we're all invested. The Henry Ford way of compensating workers, that you don't make a car unless your workers can afford to buy said car. We've now moved into much more of a this sort of like vulture capitalism of going into a corporation that's profitable or has lots of money available to it and figuring out how to cut virtually everything you can. The pensions, the workers, the assets. And we're seeing this play out right now with Trump, that they're looking to sell off government buildings through the GSA, and they're looking to sell off national parks and lands. It looks like they're trying to sell off all the assets in the coffers in a similar method to how private corporations operate right now, of like extremely lean operations and trying to make as much money as humanly possible in as short a time, whatever the cost. And the problem is, sure, it makes money for some people, but it's not an investment in the future for the people who work for those companies.
It's a divestment.
Instead of companies being viewed as not just profit making vehicles, but as pillars of the community, as the community. If you build a factory somewhere and you put down roots, you invest in the community, you invest in the businesses, you invest in the people, you give scholarships and education, and the list goes on because you're building goodwill. Because of our global marketplace where labor is all over the place, it's very much been the case that corporations can view workers less as a necessity and more as a something that they can cut and divest from without much impunity. The problem with that is that sometimes it doesn't work. And we're seeing that for the government when they're trying to cut very specialized jobs that don't exist in the private sector. That, I guess, the big brouhaha that happened lately was the Department of Transportation secretary was arguing behind closed doors that Doge is trying to fire air traffic controllers, and Trump said probably the most ignorant statement I've seen from him of, oh, just hire geniuses from MIT to be air traffic controllers, which completely belies the total ignorance of how air traffic controllers are trained and employed, that they have to go through just months and months of training, and they have to do in facility training, that they're sent to specific facilities and they have to learn like all the specific details of airports in a place,
Yeah.
and they're trained in that way. It's very rigorous, it's very stressful, and it's very
Right.
difficult, and you can't just snatch smart people from wherever from MIT,
Right.
assuming they even want to do
We
it, right? Assuming they
we
even want the most stressful job in the world.
We don't need firefighters. Just get Bobby Fischer on the case.
Yeah,
You know.
just get genius. Yeah, get genius chess players to put out fires. You bet that's gonna
yeah.
work. No, I'm being sarcastic for anyone listening. That it's not. That's not how
Uh-huh.
any of this works, and it's
hmm
just totally frustrating that you have somebody in a position of such great power who has. It takes 5 seconds to Google or or research how air traffic controllers actually learn how to do the job. It's just so completely mind-numbingly incompetent for any kind of statement
hmm
like that from somebody who's wielding so much power to be inflicting that incompetence on various facets of American society. But no, going
Yeah.
back to why are people living paycheck to paycheck? It's a confluence of forces. We're seeing it from the inflation, it's tariffs, it's increases in prices, it's limited, it's market forces that wages have been stagnant for a good 40 or 50 years for most workers in the United States. Some have increased, but most haven't. It's very flat. But prices have all increased across the board. The price of housing, the price of
hmm
healthcare, the price of food, the price of childcare. It's all going up and up. and people don't have enough money at the end of the day to pay for all of those expenses. And so that's why they're living paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, not enough people giving child care. That's I agree. So you're saying there's inflation, so if you get less inflation, you get more unions for people, and they get more money in terms of their wages and etc. Then they wouldn't be living paycheck to paycheck anymore. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah,
If so,
yeah, absolutely. Job security is important. You
mhm,
need to be able to have a predictable job that you know you're not going to lose immediately at the whims of some corporate overlord. But then job raises are important, and unions are the best mechanism to increase wages because unions have the power of you match the power of money with the power of people. That if everybody speaks with one voice and capital needs that labor in order to even accomplish anything, then it becomes very difficult for capital, for the people with the money, to make more money if the people who make them the money refuse to work unless they're paid enough money. And you see this play
yeah,
out in huge protests and strikes in other countries. The one I noticed the most, because I lived in Italy for a while, was that trash collectors in Italy were not getting paid enough for collecting garbage. And so they just stopped collecting garbage for months and months. And so you'd see just huge piles of trash bags on the sides of every street, everywhere you went, all over Italy. And that made a very loud statement, and they eventually got paid better. But one of the reasons we're seeing such sadness play out for the federal government is that in many cases they are legally prohibited from striking, right? And so the only mechanism they have for improving working conditions or improving job security or even just talking to the government saying, hey, please stop doing this, is a union because the union has collective bargaining agreements that they can engage with the government. Because if they're legally prohibited from striking, the only avenue is what? Quit or your union. Look, companies know this for a fact that companies understand that unions have so much power because Amazon wouldn't have such very complicated, multifaceted approaches to try and union bust, to try and stop unions from forming in almost every form you can think of, in every avenue through courts and through meetings and through fundraising. You name it, they've tried it, as far as I can tell, for legal avenues of stopping a union from forming because they're companies that operate all around the world, they know that the countries that have strong unions, they have to pay out more or they don't get to operate in those countries. So there's a reason why wages are much lower in the United States for some of these industries than they are around the world. It's because those countries have very strong unions. The United States doesn't. And when there are efforts made to form a union, the powers that be work hard to stop them from doing that.
Yeah, I think that unions play an important role in economies. I might add to your explanation deindustrialization. I have this idea that that wealth inequality took off in this country because the rich of this country, many of them, got richer by exporting jobs to other countries and making the previously working middle class into struggling class. They got richer and others got poorer. Now, I will say that people in third world countries also got richer, but in such a way that okay, they go from, this is just an example, if they go from making $1 a day to $10 a day, that is a great difference in their life, but it is not attributable to grand generosity from the job exporter. And I think that is why inequality in this country took off.
If you look at historical trends, there's also just the issue of supply and demand. That the supply of labor in the world population
mhm,
vastly
yeah,
exceeds the demand, as it were, for that labor, in the sense that uh, people made a lot more money in the United States after World War II because a significant chunk of the world's infrastructure and economic infrastructure and factories and various capital markets had all collapsed, and the United States was virtually unscathed through, at least the homeland part of the United States was virtually untouched in
Hmm.
terms of its economic outputs. And so the demand for workers was so great in the United States because the demand for the United States services and products was so great around the world, and there were no other significant markets to compete. Right now, the market is heavily competitive in terms of the world economy and various outputs, such that the U.S. has to compete on a sort of even playing field with these other companies, and those companies, in some cases, can hire people for much less money or require much less resources to succeed. And part of that's a function of geography that it takes. If you look at the oceans and the distances, it just takes a lot more resources for a company in the United States, in some cases, to make something compared to other parts of the world that have a much closer location to all the resources they need. It's the reason there's so many factories in China is they have a whole system set up and the logistics set up that they can do from beginning to end creation of products, right? You can get all the raw materials to the end product all in one place because they're surrounded by 12 countries and they're on the continent of Asia that got just huge amounts of resources. Part of the reason there is such inequality is that the owners of capital are raking in the money because they can, but the labor part of it is bound to a place eh, quite often, especially the poorer segments of the income distribution, in that they can't jet set around the world going to
Hmm.
wherever the opportunity is, and you're paid with the prevailing wages wherever you work, and that's
Hmm.
why unions
Hmm.
are so important. But also arguably why regulations are really important that say if you want to build something or sell something in a country, you have to pay a certain amount of money to the people who work there. And in that regard, some countries have much more robust worker protections, completely separate from unions. That the United States is a lot of states have what's called a right to work, where you can be fired for pretty much any reason. There's some exceptions, but
Right to fire.
sure, a better, yeah, it's a double speak of employers have a right
Right.
to just fire people. In
Hmm.
other countries, especially around Europe, not so. If you want to fire someone, you have to go through a really protracted, really annoying process of explaining why the person's getting fired, and there has to be justifications and appeals, and there's regulatory protections. You would expect that something like that was supposed to exist in the federal government, and arguably it does, because some of these court cases that are working their way through the system have ruled in favor of the workers, saying that there were reporting requirements that were supposed to happen. They were supposed to be given notice. They were supposed to be afforded an explanation of why they were being fired. And not just your performance didn't meet standards, but you had to provide evidence of where the performance didn't meet the standards, and that there's this sort of rush to fire people without following the procedures that are in place that are supposed to protect the workers
Hmm.
that work in the federal government.
Today in America, our healthcare system is broken, says Bernie. It is dysfunctional and it is outrageously expensive. Why?
Money, greed, right? So corporations, especially pharmaceutical companies, are allowed to charge significantly more money for medicine in the United States than other countries, so they do. And part of that
Okay.
is because of lobbying. It's if you look at the list of the top organizations that lobby in the country. Realtors are number one, pharmaceuticals are number three, and they lobby millions and millions of dollars to make sure that the system and the status quo benefits them in various ways compared to other countries. But the other issue is actually generics. If you look at India is probably the best example for this. They offer a huge range of generic alternatives to pharmaceuticals and medicines on the market that are just way less expensive than what's offered
Hmm.
in the United States. And the United States doesn't have a similar kind of system for most medicines that are on the market. You either can pay for the inhalers, or the one that I think is really expensive is the hepatitis C treatment. That's, I think it's like 70 or 80,000 last I checked of how much it is per shot. It's just wildly expensive. If there's no alternatives and you're forced to participate in the system as it is, if you want access to medicine, people's healthcare, frankly, is something that they value more than their frugality, meaning that if someone's life is on the line and they need medicine, it's very clear that people are willing to spend exorbitant sums of money to get that medicine through insurance in order to stay alive, right?
Yeah, if they're dying, they'll spend what they need to do to stay alive. Yeah.
That's where you get the sad reality of people who will make the choice to purchase medicines or procedures that vastly exceed their ability to pay, and then they turn to bankruptcy as the mechanism by which they can discharge some of those fees that they had to pay, or those the price of the medicine that they had to get. And that's why the number one cause of bankruptcy in the United States is medical debt, is that people who need a life-saving procedure, say you get a heart attack and you have to take an ambulance or get a helicopter ride from somewhere to a hospital for a hospital stay or to get a heart surgery. In most cases, people don't, when they're in an emergency, they don't get the choice of declining an ambulance or declining a hospital stay for an emergency procedure if they need it, because
Yeah.
they're incapacitated, right? They're unconscious. If someone has a heart attack and 911's called and the emergency responders show up and bring somebody who's in an active emergency state, they don't get much of a choice.
Hmm.
This exciting discussion continues next week on Mondays with Mike. We'll see you next week here on Mondays with Mike.